Have you ever been judged before you even opened your mouth? That's how Alicia Brown felt the moment she stepped into courtroom 3B. The air was heavy, not just with tension, but with the quiet whispers of doubt that always followed her skin color. She was wearing a navy blue suit, sharp and confident, holding a case file thicker than her courage had ever been tested. Everyone was watching, not because she was a lawyer, but because she was a black woman in a room full of men who didn't expect her to belong. Daniel Brooks sat beside her, nervous, his hands trembling. He was accused of stealing from a local store, a charge based on shaky footage and biased witnesses. Alicia knew this case wasn't just about Daniel's innocence. It was about how far she could push back against a system that loved to remind her of her place. The prosecutor smirked as Alicia stood to present her first argument. "Your Honor," she said firmly, "my client deserves a fair chance, not a pre-written verdict." A few heads turned, some eyes rolled, but Alicia didn't flinch. Then, from the back of the courtroom, Officer Miller leaned to another cop and whispered something that made both of them laugh. Alicia noticed. The same officer who had arrested Daniel without evidence was now standing in the courtroom, arms crossed, watching her every move. She could feel his stare burn through her like a silent threat. As Alicia began cross-examining a witness, the officer suddenly interrupted, shouting, "She doesn't belong here." The room went silent. Everyone froze. Judge Harris tried to regain order, but chaos had already taken over. Miller stormed toward her. "You think you can play lawyer?" he spat, grabbing her arm roughly. The entire courtroom gasped. Alicia's papers fell to the floor, her dignity trembling with them. "Unhand me," she said, her voice steady despite the fear in her chest. But before she could finish, Miller yanked her backward, dragging her toward the door like a criminal. The echoes of his boots matched the pounding of her heart. She didn't resist, not yet, because sometimes silence is the loudest protest. Everyone watched, the judge, the jury, even her client, helpless as racism once again wore a badge. And just when the courtroom thought they knew who she was, Alicia whispered something that made Officer Miller stop for half a second. "You have no idea who you're dragging. If you believe no one should be silenced because of their skin, subscribe to Stained Humanity, where every voice deserves to be heard. You have no idea who you're dragging." The words echoed in Officer Miller's ears, but his pride was louder than reason. He pulled Alicia toward the hallway as gasps filled the courtroom. Judge Harris shouted, "Officer, that's enough." But Miller ignored him. To him, Alicia wasn't a lawyer defending her client. She was just another black woman daring to speak too confidently in a room where men like him thought they owned the law. Her heels scraped against the marble floor as she tried to steady herself. Pain throbbed through her wrist where his grip tightened. The same people who had just watched her argue with poise now looked away, pretending not to see. That's how racism often survives, not in the shouts, but in the silence. In the corridor, Miller slammed her against the wall. "Who do you think you are, interrupting a courtroom like that?" he sneered. Alicia stared straight at him, her breathing sharp but controlled. "I didn't interrupt anything," she said. "You did." Miller laughed, leaning closer. "You lawyers think a fancy suit makes you somebody. But I know what you really are." His voice dropped to a hateful whisper. "You people always try to play victim." Alicia felt rage boiling under her calm surface, but she knew one wrong move would feed his power. Instead, she stood taller, even as pain pulsed through her arm. "You're wrong," she said quietly. "I'm not a victim. I'm proof you can't stop us from rising." The courtroom door opened again. Judge Harris rushed out, his robes swaying, shouting, "Officer Miller, release her immediately." But the officer hesitated, his authority now challenged not by a suspect, but by a woman he thought he could humiliate. Everyone was watching. The reporters who had come for Daniel's trial, the lawyers from other rooms, even random citizens standing in the hallway. And there, in front of all of them, Alicia pulled something from her jacket pocket, a small, black leather case. She flipped it open with trembling fingers. Her bar ID gleamed under the fluorescent light. The seal of the state bar shone like a quiet weapon of truth. "I'm attorney Alicia Brown," she said, her voice clear and unshaken. "And you just assaulted a lawyer in a courthouse." The corridor fell into dead silence. Miller froze. The same arrogance that dragged her moments ago now melted into fear. Judge Harris's face turned pale with fury. "Officer Miller," he said coldly, "you've just made the biggest mistake of your career." Alicia took a deep breath, straightened her jacket, and looked around. Her dignity, though bruised, stood taller than ever. Every camera phone lifted to capture her strength, the very thing they tried to strip from her. Daniel, still handcuffed inside the courtroom, watched through the open doors with tears in his eyes. For the first time, he saw not just his lawyer, but a fighter who refused to bow to injustice. Alicia turned to him and said softly, "We're not done yet, Daniel. Not even close." As she walked back toward the courtroom, her steps were slower but heavier, the steps of someone carrying generations of silent battles on her shoulders. "You believe courage still exists in the face of hate. Subscribe to Stained Humanity. Every story here reminds the world we may fall, but we never kneel." The courtroom had changed. When Alicia Brown walked back through those heavy doors, the air felt different, thicker, heavier, filled with something even louder than words: guilt. Everyone who had watched her get dragged out now avoided her eyes. Some whispered, some fidgeted, but no one apologized, not even the prosecutor who had smirked at her earlier. Judge Harris cleared his throat, his face tense. "Miss Brown," he said softly, "are you sure you wish to continue with this hearing?" Alicia glanced at Daniel, still sitting in the defendant's chair, his wrists marked from the handcuffs. His eyes begged her not to give up. "Yes, Your Honor," she said, steady as a storm before it breaks. "Justice doesn't stop because someone tried to silence it." Daniel's mother sat in the second row, tears in her eyes. She had come hoping for fairness, but all she had seen was how fragile fairness could be when skin color entered the room. The judge nodded. "Then proceed." Alicia stepped forward, gathering her fallen papers. Her hands were trembling, but her voice wasn't. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," she began, "you just witnessed what bias looks like, raw and unmasked. Now imagine what happens to people like my client, Daniel Brooks, when no one is watching." Every eye in the courtroom fixed on her. Even Officer Miller, now standing near the door, looked smaller than before, his confidence cracked. Alicia continued, pacing slowly. "Daniel was accused because a store clerk said he looked suspicious. What does suspicious mean? That he's poor, that he's black, or that someone's fear turned into an accusation?" The prosecutor tried to interrupt, but Judge Harris raised a hand. "Let her continue," he said. His tone carried something unusual: respect. Alicia turned toward the jury. "You've seen me dragged out of this courtroom, not because I broke the law, but because I challenged a system that lets power abuse color. But today you get to decide if truth still matters." A heavy silence followed. Even the air conditioner's hum seemed to pause. Then, slowly, one juror, a middle-aged woman, nodded, as if something inside her finally woke up. Another juror wiped his eyes. The room wasn't the same anymore. Alicia's courage had turned it into something sacred, a place where pain demanded to be seen. Judge Harris leaned forward. "We'll take a recess," he said quietly, his eyes softening toward Alicia. As the jury left, Miller tried to walk out too, but the judge stopped him. "Officer Miller, you'll stay. We need to discuss your conduct." Alicia sat down beside Daniel. For a moment, she let the exhaustion show. Daniel whispered, "Thank you for standing up for me." She smiled faintly. "No, Daniel," she said. "Thank you for reminding me why I became a lawyer." Her voice cracked slightly, the sound of someone who had carried too many stories of injustice but refused to drop even one. And as the gavel struck, the cameras clicked again. This time not to mock, but to remember. If this moment moved you, subscribe to Stained Humanity. Because every time truth stands tall, hate takes one step back. The courtroom doors opened again an hour later. The jury filed back in, faces serious, eyes heavy with what they had just witnessed, not just a trial, but the truth of how fragile dignity can be. Alicia sat quietly, her hand resting on the table beside Daniel. She wasn't sure what scared her more, losing the case, or losing faith in the system she had sworn to believe in. Officer Miller sat across the room now, stripped of his authority. His badge had been taken for review, but the shame on his face was punishment enough for the moment. He tried to look composed, yet every whisper from the gallery burned his pride deeper. Judge Harris cleared his throat. "Before the jury delivers its decision," he said, "I have something to say." Everyone froze. Judges rarely spoke like this. He looked straight at Alicia. "What happened in this courtroom today will not be forgotten. Miss Brown, you showed more restraint and professionalism than most would in your position. On behalf of this court, I offer my apology." The courtroom fell silent. Alicia blinked hard, holding back tears. No one had ever apologized to her like that, not for the words, not for the looks, not for the weight of centuries she carried every day she walked into a courtroom. Then Judge Harris turned to Officer Miller. "You are hereby suspended pending an internal investigation for assaulting a licensed attorney inside a court of law." The officer's mouth opened, but no sound came out. The badge that once made him untouchable now felt like a curse in his pocket, and then the jury foreman stood. "Your Honor," he said, "we have reached a verdict." Alicia held Daniel's hand under the table. The courtroom waited. The air felt thick enough to stop hearts. "We find the defendant, Daniel Brooks, not guilty." The words broke the tension like thunder splitting the sky. Daniel gasped, then covered his face as tears streamed down. Alicia smiled, the kind of smile that carries both victory and exhaustion. She closed her eyes for a moment, whispering, "Finally." Daniel's mother ran forward, hugging her son tightly. "Thank you," she cried to Alicia, her voice trembling. "You didn't just save him, you saved us." Alicia nodded softly. "No, ma'am, justice did." Reporters swarmed near the front benches, cameras flashing, microphones raised. One journalist shouted, "Miss Brown, what message do you want to give after what happened today?" Alicia paused, choosing her words carefully. "Tell them this," she said firmly. "You can drag me out of a courtroom, but you can't drag truth out of justice. Not anymore." The crowd applauded, something rare in that cold room. Even Judge Harris smiled faintly, a silent acknowledgement of courage. Later, as Alicia stepped outside into the sunlight, the world felt different. The courthouse stood behind her, no longer just a building of laws, but of lessons. Daniel and his mother followed her out, walking into freedom, their faces glowing with relief and gratitude. Officer Miller was led out the other side, head down, the very man who thought power made him untouchable now facing his own reckoning. Alicia took a long breath. The air smelled like rain and redemption. She looked at the courthouse steps and whispered to herself, "For every time they tried to silence us, we'll speak louder." The wind caught her words, carrying them across the city, to every young black woman dreaming of justice, to every person told they don't belong, to every voice waiting to rise. If this story touched your heart, subscribe to Stained Humanity. Because silence builds walls, but together, every story we share breaks one down.